So, for the benefit of our listeners, and I have a little knowledge about it, but not all that much actually. Tell us about transpersonal psychology and also more generally sort of spiritual psychology as opposed to
Sure.
whatever would be considered traditional psychology.
Sure. Transpersonal psychology started back in the late 60s with the work of, well, actually, it started with William James, but that's in the 1800s.
It
So
was
in
way
the
back, yeah.
in the late 70s, there were people like Abraham Maslow, Stan Grof. People were up in the zeitgeist at the time, all the lookings at Eastern religion and humanistic psychology. And before psychedelics became illegal, they were trying to use psychedelic drugs for healing and doing some research on that. And all of these interests outside of mainstream psychology came together and said, we want to study not only mainstream psychology, but also spirituality.
Mm.
And mainstream psychology at the time pretty much said, well, that's a bunch of woo woo and that's new age strange stuff. And we were like, well, we think it's a valid part of human development. And maybe it's the higher reaches of human development or the more expanded sense of self. So transpersonal psychology has continued to evolve as we study mainstream psychology, but we don't think that's enough. We think there's also spiritual search, unusual experiences people have. We study people who have experiences who believe they have experiences with UFOs or ghosts, or we think how interesting that people would have these experiences. We don't necessarily say if we agree with them or not, but we say it's an interesting part of human experience.
Hmm.
We study psychedelics and all these kinds of ways of expanded consciousness.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the things you're describing, as I recall, from my learning about psychology way back in the probably in the Lincoln administration, I think. I mean, not quite that far back, but there certainly was, I mean, actually, even more recently than my learnings, there was a trend there for quite a while and still is in some places that if you can't measure it and can't observe it externally, it's not worth studying. It isn't really science. And so that would rule out even things as weird as common as feelings. But certainly it would rule out people's descriptions of their own experiences as valid subjects of study. And you're saying, no, actually, people's descriptions of their experiences, including things like spiritual experience and other than easily explainable experience, those are worthy of study and worthy of deeper understanding. Do I understand what you're
That's
saying?
exactly right.
Yeah.
I thought of this analogy the other day. It's like if you go out on a weekend and you hike to the top of a beautiful hike and you have a beautiful vista, and you kind of have one of those cosmic experiences like, oh, everything's right with the world. And it's just so, you just kind of have that moment where it seems timeless. And we call this a peak experience. You go back to work on Monday and people say, what happened over the weekend? You have to say, I went hiking.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no place in our society really, unless you're in a small group of like-minded people, to just say, oh, wow, I had this cosmic experience.
Hmm. Yeah.
Now, in the realm of sex, for example, mainstream sexology has come a long way. It's really about measuring and telling us how often we should have sex and how long it should last and why does it go down when we get older, which I think all three of us know it doesn't have to necessarily.
Hmm.
And what are the statistics about it and what should you do? And here's how you should be having sex if you're normal and so on. And this totally leaves out, for my doctoral program, I just did a review of all the journals. I think it was 13 journals since inception. And I have to tell you, it was quite shocking to see there were very few articles in the sexological journals about relationship, about meaning,
Mm.
about love, about affection,
Hmm.
nothing about spirituality. So that to me is the most interesting thing about sex is not how long it lasts or what the measurements are, but, and I guess I'm in a privileged position that I don't have to worry about those things, but what is the meaning? What's the nature of the relationship? How does it make love, etc. So these more transpersonal elements are really, I think, of the most value.
Yeah.
You'd think from this late 70s when you saw spiritual sex that it would have come a little bit farther since then, but it sounds like it hasn't.
Not in the mainstream literature, certainly.
Mhm.
There's a certain rise amongst educated people who live on the West Coast, probably in Tantra, of a certain brand of Tantra that's we could call Western Tantra, but it's a very small percentage of the population. And I know Facebook and Amazon will still both prohibit you from using the word Tantra.